Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Ruy Lopez, one of the most popular king's pawn openings in chess. So here we go, we're at our chessboard, and the Ruy Lopez begins with e4, e5, a symmetrical king's pawn opening, knight to f3, white attacks this pawn and black defends it with knight c6, and white plays here bishop to b5. This is the move that constitutes the Ruy Lopez. And this is one of the oldest known chess openings. It's named after a 16th century Spanish priest who popularized it. And we see White's idea here. White's playing very much in accordance with the opening principles. White's controlling space in the center. They just develop two pieces and they're ready to castle very fast. Very good things. And this bishop here exerts some positional pressure on Black, because at the right moment, White might be threatening to exchange this bishop for the knight and then win this undefended e5 pawn. That's one of White's ideas in the Ruy Lopez. So let's talk about how Black can play against the Ruy Lopez and where the game can go from here. We're going to start out by discussing Black's most popular move, which is to play a6 and attack this bishop. But then at the end of this video, we're going to circle back and discuss Black's other possibilities to play in this position. So okay, a6, attacking the bishop. This is a useful move for Black to play because it forces this bishop to commit and make a decision. Now you might be wondering, why doesn't this idea I just mentioned work? Why can't White just exchange off here, bishop for knight, that's an even trade, and then win this undefended e5 pawn? It turns out this doesn't work right away, and this is very good for a Ruy Lopez player to know. It turns out that if you take this knight, Black can capture with the d pawn, unleashing this bishop. And now if you try to win this pawn, Black will win a pawn back with queen d4, forking your knight and pawn. You have to save that knight. Black wins their pawn back. And White doesn't have such a great position here. You probably don't want to play king f1, and after queen e2, White certainly does not have an advantage in this position. Black does have doubled pawns, but the two strong bishops and your king being out here in the open are more than enough for Black to be happy here. So Black knows that you cannot win a pawn right away because of this queen d4 trick. So, instead, White has a couple options here after a6. White can retreat the bishop to a4, or White can exchange off for this knight. So let's first look at this, the exchange variation. What if White takes this knight? This move is not as popular these days, but world champion Bobby Fischer used to love playing this move, and there's certainly still some players who play it. We've said that White shouldn't try to take this pawn and win a pawn right away, but let's say White just castles, and now Black defends this undefended pawn, and White tries to open the center by playing d4, and we get some position that looks like this. And now let's discuss what's happened here. White has succeeded in getting a very favorable pawn structure here. We see on the king side, this side of the board, White has a 4-on-3 pawn majority. And on the queen side, Black has a 4-on-3 pawn majority, but it's crippled because of these doubled pawns, and this means in a lot of endgames, Black will not be able to create a passed pawn. White can set up a pawn structure where his 3 pawns will stop Black's 4 pawns, and meanwhile, White can create a passed pawn by playing something like f4 and e5 at a much later point, getting this strong passed e-pawn that he can try to march and become a queen. And it turns out, in a lot of endgames, this is a very big advantage for White. White has the healthier pawn structure, and that's an advantage that's going to persist in the long term. But White did have to make a concession to get this better pawn structure. We see that Black has the bishop pair. Black has 2 bishops, and White no longer has 2 bishops. And in a wide open position, we see the center's pretty open here. This can be an advantage for Black. These 2 bishops both have open lines to develop, and Black has the bishop pair working for him here. Not to mention, we're a long ways away from an endgame, where White can try to create this passed pawn, and in the meantime, Black even sometimes can castle queenside, put the king here on c8, and use this consolidated pawn mass here as a good shelter for that king. So the overall high-level conclusion here for the exchange variation is that White gets this long-term, enduring advantage of the better pawn structure, but we're still a long ways away from an endgame, and Black has reasons to be pretty happy in the meantime. So after a6, White will often not take that knight and instead retreat the bishop and play bishop a4, still retaining the possibility of taking later if it better suits White, but also retaining the possibility to reroute this bishop to a better diagonal later on, maybe to c2 or maybe to b3. So in this position, Black usually plays knight to f6, very logical move. Black develops a piece and attacks this e4 pawn. Now, a lot of players here with White would play just d3 defending this pawn, or maybe knight c3 defending the pawn, but you can actually just castle here. That's one of the very nice things about the Ruy Lopez. It's so aligned with the classical opening principles, and you get to castle really early. It is true that your e4 pawn's not defended, but it's going to be really hard for black to just take that pawn and hold on to it, because you're castled, black's not. Black's still a couple moves away from getting castled, so opening up the center would be pretty dangerous for black. Let's look what happens if they decide to take this pawn. If they play knight takes e4, then white can try to open the center right away and play this move d4. And if black were to take this pawn, then these pins on the e-file could become very dangerous for black, where that knight's pinned to the king. So instead, black will often give the pawn back. They'll just kick the bishop away, play d5 and take some space, and now white can win their pawn back, and white's not down any material. This is called the open Ruy Lopez, because the center was opened up there a little bit. But instead, black doesn't have to take on e4, so after castles, black's most popular move here is to just play bishop e7, keep developing, get closer to getting castled, and now that there's no more pins on the e-file to the king, black really is threatening to take this e4 pawn, so now white will usually defend it and play rook e1. Now, from white's perspective, it's kind of nice he was able to defend this pawn without having to commit to pawn to d3 or knight to c3, because this rook is a good defender of the pawn. The rook does really nothing on f1, so why not put it to use and put it on this e-file? Plus, it leaves white open to playing c3 and d4 later, fighting for more central space, because his knight doesn't have to block this c-pawn. Now, after rook e1, now white really is threatening to take on c6 and win this free pawn. There's no more tricks with a fork of the knight and pawn, because white's e-pawn is defended. So after white defends this e-pawn, now is the best moment for black to play b5 and kick this bishop away. That's one of the main reasons black plays a6 early on, to force that bishop to commit to the a4 square, so black always knows he can kick that bishop away at a moment's notice later on. And now after the forced bishop b3, black will often play d6, just defending this pawn and opening a line for this bishop. And I'll just show you how the game can progress from here. Again, white has other ways to play. White can play a4 and challenge this b5 pawn directly, try to get this rook involved. That's often a plan for white later on, but the most popular line is to play c3 and fight for more space here and play d4. So let's look at how this can go. Black can castle. Now white usually plays h3, because it just turns out that if you play d4 right away, then bishop g4 is kind of annoying. Black is threatening to take this knight, kind of deflect your queen away, and then this pawn would be hanging, and this forces white to maybe close the middle and play d5. You can play this way, but a lot of players prefer to play h3 first before playing d4. And now after h3, black has a lot of possibilities here. I'll just show one of the most popular, called the Chigorin variation, to illustrate how both sides really fight for central space. Black often plays knight a5, attacking this bishop, and also threatening to get their their c-pawn involved here in the fight for the center. White will usually not want to let this knight exchange for the bishop. This bishop can be a very powerful piece on this diagonal, and this knight's kind of on the side of the board for now. So bishop c2 is almost always played, and now c5 and d4. Lots of pawn tension, but everything is adequately defended after black plays queen c7, adding another supporter to the e5 pawn, and this is a very typical kind of position you get from the Ruy Lopez. Again, very classical opening, definitely adheres to those opening principles of developing fast, castling, and fighting for space. Both sides are definitely fighting for the center here. And it might look like this knight is kind of blocked from going to its best square, but I just want to show one knight maneuver that's popular in the Ruy Lopez. At some point, this knight will often swing over to the king side via d2, f1, and g3. I was really impressed by that idea when I first saw it as a beginner. It never occurred to me to use the f1 square like that and bring a knight back to the first rank to swing it around to the king side and make sure you can develop harmoniously. So, there was a lot going on there, and of course both sides have many alternatives, many of which probably deserve their own video. I'll just mention one right now. I've experimented with this one. After knight f6, we said white can castle here. I've experimented with this move queen e2, which is called the Worrell attack. And the idea here is that white's going to castle, and then the rook can come to the d-file instead of the e-file, and then when you play c3 and d4, this rook will be eyeing this queen, so it's harder for black to just defend everything with d6. Kind of a very high-level plan there, because of course after d6 you could open the d-file, takes, and your rook would be opposite that queen. Of course, needless to say, it takes many moves for that plan to come to fruition, and black has ways to deal with that setup as well. It's definitely not as popular as the very principled castling. Alright, so that was a glimpse into the mainline Ruy Lopez with a6, and as I promised, let's go back to this position and talk about black's alternative moves. So one of their most popular moves is to play knight f6 right away. not playing the move a6 and immediately attacking this pawn, and this is called the Berlin defense. This has become very popular in high-level chess, and let's take a look at black's idea. So what if white castles, like we saw before? Black takes the e4 pawn, white tries to open the center, and now we see why black decided to leave the bishop on this square. Black can play this move knight d6, getting this knight out of the way of any pins before the center opens up, and attacking this loose bishop here on b5. If white wants to win their pawn back, they often should exchange this bishop off. Now they can win their pawn back, and play usually goes to this very famous endgame, called the Berlin endgame, because this is the Berlin defense. And once again, we see a trade-off kind of similar to what we discussed in the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez, where white has the better pawn structure, white has a healthy 4-on-3 against black's crippled 4-on-3, but black has the two powerful open bishops. At first you would think white has an advantage here, especially because the black king can no longer castle, but at top tier chess, it's been very hard lately for white to prove any advantage here. This has been analyzed very thoroughly. Black has been able to score a lot of draws and even a couple wins from this position, and it's become so popular as a defense for black that a lot of players with white here have stopped playing this line where they castle and go to this endgame and simply passively defend their e4 pawn here with a move like d3, which is somewhat of a concession, but a lot of players with white just want to avoid that endgame, avoid all these highly analyzed lines, and just play a middle game from there. Okay, that was the Berlin defense. Now let's talk about d6, which is the Steinitz variation. Black simply makes sure that this e5 pawn is defended, but the disadvantage is you're kind of self-pinning your knight to your king now, and white will usually play d4 and kind of exploit this, making a grab for central space, and once again threatening your e5 pawn. And black has to be a little careful here. It's easy for black to go wrong if they don't know this line very well. I actually got a big advantage in a tournament game I played many years ago when my opponent played a6 here, which is definitely a mistake. They probably mixed up the move orders here and weren't paying attention, because now white's idea really works. White can just exchange off the bishop for the knight, and white simply has two attackers here on the e5 pawn, and black only has one defender. White can simply win this pawn. There's no more tricks with some queen d4 fork to get the pawn back. White really is just up a pawn for good. Black can avoid this, of course, going back after d6, d4. Let's say black just exchanges off these pawns, and both sides will usually kind of develop from here, but white does have kind of a lead in development and a little more space in the center, so it's considered a little passive for black, but certainly a viable choice. Coming back to move 3, another choice black has is to play bishop c5. This is called the classical variation, and you might have been wondering in the main line, why did black play the bishop to this passive e7 square? Why didn't it go out to c5, where it looks a lot more active? And this is true. The upside of this move is the bishop is a lot more active here, but we're going to see the downside after white simply castles, knight f6. This bishop is really walking right into white's plan to play c3 and now d4 on the next turn. White is going to have enough support to play this move. They have 1, 2, 3 supporters there, and black has 3 attackers on that square, so the move will be safe, and that means this bishop is probably going to have to move again. And if it comes to b6, it will maybe be blunted by this white pawn in the center. Also, if the bishop commits to b6 after white plays d4, because that bishop's missing from the king side, some of white's pins might be more effective here to play bishop g5 and pin that knight to the queen, and it could be kind of annoying to deal with that in some continuations. Nonetheless, bishop c5, the classical variation, definitely a playable option against the Ruy Lopez as black. Alright, after bishop b5, another one of black's options is the bird defense here, with knight to d4. Now you're probably thinking that it's a violation of opening principles to move the same piece twice in the opening without a good reason, but we're going to see black's idea. Black simply turns the tables on this bishop, attacks it, and if white exchanges off here, now white's bishop looks a little silly here on b5. It doesn't really make much sense there. It's going to be a target for black to expand in the center later, possibly, where black can play c6 with a tempo. And there's some other funny ways that black can try to exploit this. For example, if white plays c3 here, black even has this move, queen to g5, forking the bishop and the g2 pawn when white has to play bishop f1, which does not look desirable, of course. So that's the main idea of the bird defense, to kind of make this bishop useless here on b5, even though black is moving the same piece twice in the opening. I'll show you how I like to handle this as white. I like to take on d4, black takes, and I like playing this move bishop to c4. Now I moved the same piece twice in the opening, so I kind of let black make up for them moving the same piece twice, But the bishop's just much better placed on c4 now, and if black's not careful, they can fall into a little trap here. Let's say black plays bishop c5, which looks like a very normal move, simply developing this bishop. Go ahead and pause the video here if you want, and see if you can find white's best move. Okay, if you said to play queen h5, forking the bishop and checkmate here on f7, you are almost right, but not quite. Black can play queen e7 here and defend both of your threats. White's probably still doing okay here, but there's something much better you missed. So after bishop c5, you should change the move order there up a little bit. Take on f7 first, you sacrifice a bishop to win a pawn, but now after queen h5, you are going to get your bishop back. And white remains up a pawn, and the king can't castle, and this is winning for white. So there's a little trap your opponent can fall into there if you play bishop c4. Sorry, if you play bishop c4 against the bird. Make sure they don't play bishop c5, or else you can win right away with bishop takes f7 and get a big advantage. Okay, next up for black is the Schliemann gambit, which is this move f5, which looks like a pawn sacrifice. This is one of black's more aggressive attempts to meet the Ruy Lopez. And it turns out it's not very easy for white to accept this pawn sacrifice. If white tries to win this pawn, then white's foothold in the center here disappears, and black can advance with e4, kicking this knight. And white can try to play queen e2 here and pin this pawn to the king, but usually black will succeed in getting their pawn back. Black can break this pin with queen e7, and now if this knight wants to go to any reasonable square, you probably have to exchange the bishop for the knight, and now black opens this bishop up, and they're probably going to recollect their pawn, kind of with interest, as we say. Black succeeded in getting this strong central pawn here on e4. So it's actually not too common for white to accept this pawn sacrifice. So you might be thinking, if white can't accept the pawn sacrifice, why doesn't everyone play this move f5 and really grab some space in the center? But of course it is weakening the king a little bit, and I'll show you a way for white to exploit this. One of the moves I like to play here is d3. White can also play knight c3, defending the pawn, but I like to play this move d3. Sorry, let's just clear those arrows. Now white really is threatening to take on f5 next turn, because black can no longer play e4 and kick white's knight around. So if black exchanges these pawns off and plays knight f6, we'll see how the game can go. White usually castles right away. We know it's dangerous for black to take this pawn before they're castled. When white's already castled, we've seen this pop up already a couple times. But if black plays bishop c5 and tries to develop actively, white can actually stop black from castling thanks to their missing f-pawn. White can play queen to d3 here. So, see if you can see the point here. The point is if black castles, then queen c4 would win. There's a fork against the king and bishop, and white wins the whole piece. So black cannot castle here. And if black plays d6 to defend this bishop, now they're threatening to castle next turn, but now queen c4, stopping them from castling yet again, and also stopping them from developing their bishop to e6. So now we see one of the downsides of black choosing to move that f-pawn so early, which is very often the case when you move the f-pawn in the opening. Even if it's not a bad move, there is often some upside your opponent can try to exploit. And the lines go pretty deep from here. I'll just show one of the continuations. Queen e7, threatening to play bishop e6 and kick that queen away and castle. And white usually plays knight c3 so that they can meet this with knight to d5, attacking the queen. It's a complicated line. Again, probably deserves its own video to really go deep into the analysis of it. But this is the trade-off from a high level. Black gets to fight for some central space early on, get the f-pawn involved in the action. But in return, it's a little weakening of their king, and white has ways to try to exploit this. Okay, and one more possibility black can play against the Ruy Lopez. Just to recap so far, we've looked at the main line with a6, we've looked at the Berlin defense with knight f6, the Steinitz defense d6, the bird defense, knight d4, the classical variation with bishop c5, and the gambit here with f5, the Schliemann gambit. Okay, one more option black has is the Cozo defense, where black plays knight g to e7 and simply reinforces this knight. Black avoids all the double pawn problems here, and if white ever exchanges here on c6, the other knight can simply take its place. This is a close cousin, by the way, of the fianchetto variation, so I'm kind of lumping them together. Black sometimes plays g6 here in this position, but this is kind of a common setup between these two lines. The knight usually comes to e7 and the bishop usually comes to g7. For example, in this position, black usually follows up by fianchettoing and then castling to the king side as one of black's ideas. White has a couple ways to deal with this. White can certainly castle very fast and sometimes strike at the center with either d4 or c3 and then d4, as we've seen in some lines. Black will sometimes be in a good position to strike back at the center with d5 in some of those cases. For example, I think there's a line that goes castles, g6, c3, bishop g7, d4. Black exchanges in the center. And it looks like white succeeded in taking over the whole center. They got their c-pawn to help out and reinforce that d-pawn, and they're ready to start bullying the black pieces. But black's just in time to play d5 here with the support of this e7 knight and kind of stabilize everything. White can play e5, of course, and this leads to a kind of a typical locked center position. So that's one option of how the game can go. One line that I've started to like with white is to play this move knight to c3 against knight g to e7. Now, like I've said, you usually don't want to play knight c3 in some of these Ruy Lopez lines, because you want to leave the possibility open to play c3 and d4. But I kind of like knight c3 here. A lot of times, if you play knight c3 early on in the Ruy Lopez, you just transpose to a 4 knights game after black plays knight f6. I'll just show an example. Like after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, the Berlin defense, and we showed how white can either castle here or defend the pawn with d3. But if white plays knight c3, it's just back to a 4 knights game, which is considered not one of white's kind of more ambitious attempts here to get an advantage. Certainly nothing wrong with it, but a lot of Ruy Lopez players don't want to play the 4 knights game, because if they did, they would probably just play knight c3 here on move 3 instead of playing the more ambitious bishop b5. But against the Cozo defense here, after knight g to e7, you cannot go back to a 4 knights game. Black can't put this knight on f6, and so playing knight c3 here kind of avoids the 4 knights. And there's some fun lines I've studied where white can even play knight d5 very fast. For example, if black continues with their plan and plays g6, one of the lines I really like here is to play d4, and if black takes, to not even take back right away, but to play knight to d5. If black takes this knight, this doesn't look so great for them. This knight's probably going to have to move, and then we can win our pawn back, probably under better circumstances. And if black continues with bishop g7, now bishop g5 is kind of annoying for them. We already have some threats, for example, to take this knight. Now this knight can no longer recapture because it's pinned, and then this knight would actually be hanging. We have 2 attackers on it, and black only has 1 defender, and black's under a little bit of pressure here. Alright, I hope this video gave you a better understanding of the Ruy Lopez. This was one of the first openings I really studied deeply when I was starting out in chess, and I still play it to this day with white. And by the way, if you haven't signed up yet on chesspathways.com, please make sure you do that right now. Just type in chesspathways.com. I'll put a link down in the description. Get signed up there. It only takes a couple seconds. It's completely free, and I'll make sure to send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join, and make sure you don't miss out on any new content. Thanks!